There is a weapon so powerful that most men never learn to use it, not because it is difficult to acquire, not because it requires years of training or rare talent, but because everything in modern life is designed to make you forget it exists. It requires nothing but the discipline to stop, to say nothing, to let the silence sit heavy in the room while everyone else scrambles to fill it. This weapon has ended careers, broken negotiations, shifted power dynamics in seconds, and exposed the inner architecture of every person in the room without a single word being spoken. The weapon is silence, and the man who masters it becomes the most dangerous person in any space he enters. Machiavelli understood this centuries before the age of social media, instant messaging, and the performance culture that makes people feel they must constantly speak to prove they exist. He watched kings lose their power the moment they started explaining themselves. He watched lesser men rise simply by learning when to shut their mouths and let others destroy themselves with words. The most powerful men in any court, he observed, were not always the loudest. They were the ones whose silence made other men nervous, the ones who spoke only when they had something final to say, something that couldn't be argued with because it had been delivered with such weight and certainty that questioning it felt like a social miscalculation. This is not a video about introversion. This is not a meditation on the virtues of quiet personalities. This is something far more practical and far more dangerous. This is about learning to use silence the way a master swordsman uses stillness before the strike, not as absence, as presence, not as weakness, as control. Because silence deployed correctly doesn't communicate nothing, it communicates everything, and what it communicates most powerfully is this: I do not need you. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why silence wins every power game, why it exposes insecurity in others, why it commands respect without demanding it, why it is the single most underestimated tool of social dominance available to any man willing to stop talking long enough to use it. And you will understand how to build it into the fabric of the way you move through the world, not as a technique you remember to apply, but as an identity you inhabit. Part 1. The noise of the powerless. Start by looking honestly at the world around you. Listen to conversations at work, at social gatherings, in meetings, online. What do you hear? Constant filler. Constant explanation, people justifying their positions before anyone challenges them, people laughing before the joke lands, softening their statements before anyone disagrees, ending declarative sentences with the upward lilt of a question as if seeking approval for the facts they're delivering. People who send 3 messages when 1 would do. People who respond to silence with more words, afraid that quiet means something has gone wrong. All of this noise is the sound of insecurity in motion. Watch what happens when someone feels their value is not being recognized. They talk more. They repeat themselves. They add detail that wasn't asked for. They explain and re-explain. They fill every pause with content, terrified that silence will be interpreted as emptiness, as lack of substance, as inadequacy. And ironically, this relentless filling of space accomplishes exactly the opposite of what they intend. Instead of communicating depth, it communicates desperation. Instead of projecting confidence, it projects need. The more they speak, the less powerful they appear. The more they justify, the more guilt they seem to carry. Musashi saw this on the battlefield. The warrior who taunted before striking was already losing because he was seeking a psychological advantage through noise that the truly confident warrior didn't need. The samurai who was genuinely unafraid didn't announce it. His stillness announced it for him. His opponents felt it before a single word was exchanged. The posture, the breathing, the unhurried quality of his presence told everyone watching, this man has nothing to prove. And the man who has nothing to prove is the most unsettling opponent you can face because you cannot read him, you cannot predict him, you don't know what he's thinking, and that uncertainty costs you far more than any intimidation technique he could deploy. In modern social life, this dynamic plays out everywhere. The person who texts back immediately is perceived differently than the one who responds in their own time. The job candidate who talks throughout the interview fills every silence with nervous filler, perceived differently than the one who pauses, thinks, and then delivers precisely chosen words. The man in a negotiation who speaks first when silence falls, perceived differently than the one who simply waits. In every case, the silent party is experienced as stronger, not because silence is inherently impressive, but because the choice to remain silent in a culture that pathologizes quiet and rewards constant self-expression signals a level of self-containment that triggers something ancient and involuntary in the human psyche. Respect. You were told to speak up. You were told that confidence means being heard. You were sold the idea that the man who commands the room is the man who fills it with his voice. This is one of the most costly lies modern culture has produced. The man who commands the room is often the man who speaks least and means most when he does. Part 2. What silence actually communicates. Let's be precise about what silence says, because it is not nothing. It is a complete vocabulary in itself, and learning to read it is the first step toward learning to use it. When you ask someone a question and they pause before answering, a real pause, unhurried, apparently comfortable, what do they communicate? They communicate that they are not afraid of this moment, that they have no urgent need to perform for you, that whatever answer they give has been chosen rather than reflexively produced. Their silence says, I think before I speak, which means when I speak, you should listen. That pause is not emptiness, it is weight, it is authority. It changes the quality of every word that follows it. When someone insults you or challenges you and you say nothing, not the silence of someone frozen by the blow, but the silence of someone who has registered the attack and chosen not to dignify it, what do you communicate? You communicate that the attack did not land where it was intended, that you are not a system that outputs a predictable reaction when a specific input is applied, that the person who threw the insult misjudged the target. And this is profoundly disorienting for the person who attacked you, because they have lost the confirmation they were seeking. They wanted a reaction. They wanted evidence that they reached you. Your silence denies them that evidence, and in denying it makes them question their own position. They threw something, and it disappeared into stillness. Now, they're looking at you wondering, does he not care? Or does he know something I don't? This uncertainty is power, not your power over them in any crude or aggressive sense, but the power that flows from being unreadable. When people cannot predict you, they cannot prepare for you. When they cannot prepare for you, they are always slightly off balance in your presence. And slightly off balance is exactly where you want them, because you are not off balance. You are still. You are watching, and everything they do to fill the silence they created by trying to provoke you is giving you information. When someone confesses something to the silence after you've asked a question and then simply waited, not prodding, not encouraging, just waiting, what has happened? They have given you more than they intended to give. Because silence held by someone who is genuinely comfortable with it is experienced by most people as a kind of pressure, a space that needs to be filled, a question that needs to be answered, and in their rush to fill it, they reveal, they self-expose. They say things they hadn't planned to say because the silence was pulling the words out of them like water from a well. Skilled interrogators know this. Skilled negotiators know this. Skilled leaders know this. The most effective question is often no question at all. Ask once, then go quiet, and let the other person hand you everything. Part 3. The 4 silences of power. Not all silence is the same. The man who is quiet because he has nothing to say is not the same as the man who is quiet because he is choosing to say nothing. The difference is everything, and anyone with developed social perception can feel it. Let me break down the 4 distinct silences that operate in power dynamics, because mastering each one differently is how you become genuinely formidable across all social contexts. The first is strategic silence, the deliberate withholding of information or reaction in order to maintain advantage. This is the silence of the chess player who doesn't reveal his strategy, the executive who doesn't signal his decision before the meeting is over, the man in a negotiation who makes an offer and then goes completely still while the other side processes it. Strategic silence is about controlling information flow. The less you reveal, the less others can prepare for you, predict you, or counter you. Machiavelli practiced this instinctively. He never telegraphed his analysis or his conclusions. He let the situation develop until he could see it clearly, then moved. By the time others understood what had happened, it was already done. The second is absorptive silence, the silence of the listener who takes everything in without reacting. This is perhaps the most powerful form of silence in social relationships because it is the rarest. Most people cannot truly listen. While you are speaking, they are preparing their response. They are filtering what you say through their own framework and filing it against their own experiences. They are with you physically, but largely absent mentally. The man who can practice genuine absorptive silence, who can sit with another person and truly receive what they are saying without immediately processing it through the lens of his own response, develops something extraordinary. He knows people. He knows what they actually mean rather than what they say. He knows where their fears are and where their desires are and what they are protecting and what they are seeking. That knowledge is leverage, not leverage for exploitation, leverage for understanding, for navigation, for the kind of relational intelligence that lets you move through any group dynamic with precision. The third is punishing silence, the strategic withdrawal of presence after someone has crossed a line. This is silence as consequence, not the dramatic withdrawal of the emotionally reactive man who sulks to communicate his wound, but the quiet, unhurried removal of access and attention from someone who has revealed that they don't deserve it. The difference is critical. Punishing silence, done correctly, requires no announcement, no "you'll hear from me when I'm ready," no indication that you are doing it deliberately. You simply become less available, less engaged, less present. The space you occupied in someone's life contracts without drama, and they feel it like a change in atmospheric pressure. They can't point to a moment you withdrew. They can't accuse you of punishing them because you've given them nothing overt to accuse, but they feel the absence of what was there before, and they have to sit with the question of whether they caused it. This uncertainty, not knowing if they've lost access to you and why, is far more effective at producing reflection and course correction than any confrontation or ultimatum. Musashi never chased people who had wronged him. He simply made them irrelevant, and nothing makes a man reconsider his behavior faster than becoming irrelevant to someone he wanted to matter to. The fourth is receptive silence, the silence after you have spoken, during which you wait. This is perhaps the most underused silence of all, and the one that most visibly separates powerful communicators from ordinary ones. Most people finish speaking and immediately continue. They fill their own silence because they are uncomfortable with the possibility that their words might land in a void. But the man who speaks and then waits, who lets his words sit in the room for a moment while the silence does its work, communicates something entirely different. He communicates certainty that what he said was worth hearing. He communicates that he is not anxious about your reaction. He communicates that he has finished making his point and will let you process it before he says anything further. This receptive silence after speaking is what transforms statements into declarations. It is what makes the same words spoken by two different men carry completely different weight. Part 4. The cost of constant speech. Let me show you what you are actually doing when you talk too much. Not in terms of perception, we've covered that, but in terms of strategic position. Because every word you speak is a reveal. Every explanation is a map of your thinking that someone else can read. Every justification is a declaration of where you feel vulnerable. Every opinion offered unprompted is an invitation for challenge. Every joke made to fill silence is evidence that silence makes you anxious. Every message sent to check why someone hasn't responded is a transfer of power. Think about what happens in a negotiation when you speak first after making an offer. You are telling the other party that you are uncomfortable with the silence, that the uncertainty of waiting for their response is more painful to you than whatever concession you're about to make to end it. So they wait, and you talk yourself into a worse deal than you would have accepted if you'd simply stayed quiet and let the discomfort sit. Experienced negotiators know this so well, it's a fundamental principle. The first person to talk after an offer is made loses. Not because talking is inherently weak, but because voluntary, anxiety-driven speech in a silence where you should be waiting transfers leverage in one direction only. Think about what happens when you justify a decision to someone who didn't ask for justification. You are communicating that you believe their approval of your decision matters to you, that you feel, on some level, accountable to their judgment, that you are not fully confident in the decision itself, even when the decision is correct, even when your reasoning is sound. The act of explaining it when explanation wasn't requested signals doubt, and doubt, even manufactured doubt, created simply by an unnecessary explanation, gives others leverage over you that they didn't have before. Think about what happens when you are angry and you express it immediately, completely in real time. You are giving the person who made you angry a complete map of your emotional architecture. They know exactly what crossed the line. They know exactly how hard. They know what you value, what you protect, what you cannot tolerate. Every piece of that information can be used, not necessarily with malice, most people aren't scheming, but the knowledge of where your lines are is knowledge of how to navigate around you, under you, over you. The man who processes his anger in private and then responds from a position of calculated calm gives nothing away. He reveals his conclusion without revealing his wound. He is 10 steps harder to manipulate than the man who bleeds openly. Part 5. The architecture of disciplined silence. Knowing that silence is power is different from actually building it into the way you operate. Because silence, for most men, doesn't come naturally. They were trained out of it. Silence in childhood was often met with a prompt to speak. Silence in social situations triggers anxiety about being perceived as unfriendly, dull, or disengaged. Silence in conflict feels like surrender. Silence after an accusation feels like guilt. The nervous system has been conditioned to interpret silence as a problem that needs to be solved with words. Dismantling that conditioning requires deliberate, repeated practice in progressively higher stakes situations. Begin where the cost of silence is low. Conversations where you currently speak reflexively, not because you have something specific to add, but because speaking is your default. Practice inserting pauses. Ask a question and wait, actually wait, for 3 full seconds before adding any qualifier or softener. Make a point and let it sit for 2 beats before continuing. In these low-stakes moments, you are training your nervous system to tolerate the discomfort of social silence without interpreting that discomfort as an emergency that requires words. Then move to medium-stakes situations, disagreements where you currently feel the urge to defend yourself immediately. Meetings where you typically speak to fill space rather than to contribute. Group settings where the habit of speaking is partly about being seen rather than heard. In these contexts, practice a different sequence. Observe before you speak. Let others reveal their positions first. Let the room clarify its own dynamics before you introduce your weight into it. You will notice, almost immediately, that waiting gives you information you wouldn't have had if you'd spoken first. You will hear things people say when they believe they are safe, that they would never say in response to your direct questioning. You will understand more about what is actually happening beneath the surface of any conversation by watching it for a moment longer than you currently allow yourself to. Then, finally, the high-stakes situations. The confrontation where someone says something designed to provoke a reaction. The accusation that is not true. The disrespect in a public setting. The test. This is where everything you've trained for either holds or doesn't. This is where the man who has been building his capacity for silence over weeks and months discovers what it can actually do. Here is what disciplined silence in a genuine high-stakes moment looks like. Someone challenges you, insults you, accuses you, undermines you publicly. Your immediate physiological response is real. Adrenaline, the urge to respond, to defend, to strike back. That urge is information. It tells you that something important was just targeted. But the man who has trained his capacity for silence has a gap between the urge and the response. A half second, a second, 2 seconds of stillness during which his face remains neutral. His breathing stays measured, and he makes a choice about how to respond rather than simply reacting. He may then choose to say something, but what he says comes from that place of stillness rather than from the immediate emotional reaction, which means it will be more precise, more powerful, and more strategically chosen than anything the raw reaction would have produced. Or he may choose to say nothing. 2. Let the room sit with the accusation hanging unanswered, and in that unanswered silence, everyone present is forced to interpret, to fill in. And what they fill in is almost always a measure of the power differential they perceive. If they perceive the silent man as strong, which they will if his posture and stillness communicate composure rather than paralysis, their interpretation of his silence will be, he knows something we don't. He is above this. This didn't reach him. Part 6. Silence. In the digital age, the most dangerous arena for silence in the modern world is digital, because digital communication has engineered urgency around response time, turned the read receipt into a social pressure mechanism, and created an expectation of constant availability that serves everyone's interests except yours. When someone sends you a message and you respond within seconds every time, you are telling them something about your hierarchy of priorities. You are communicating that whatever they have sent you is more immediately important than whatever you were doing before they sent it. You are training them to expect that immediacy. And then, paradoxically, when something genuinely important comes up where you need time and space to think before responding, the delay is interpreted as unusual, as a sign that something is wrong, that you're upset, that the relationship has shifted. The reverse is also true. The person who responds in their own time, not as a calculated game, but as a genuine expression of their life having other priorities, trains the people around them to understand that contact with them works differently, that they will be heard and responded to, but not immediately and not reflexively. This creates a different dynamic in every digital relationship. Their responses, when they come, carry more weight, because they are not one of 37 messages sent before 9 a.m. They land differently because they are not the product of compulsive checking. And the relationship itself is structured around something closer to reality, that this person has a life, has priorities, and chooses to engage rather than being available by default. This is silence applied digitally, not manipulation, not games. Just the honest expression of the fact that your attention is finite and what you give it to says everything about what you actually value. Apply it to social media. The urge to respond to every comment, to correct every mischaracterization, to defend every piece of your work or your character that someone somewhere chooses to attack. Every response you make to that noise enters you into a game you cannot win. Not because you're wrong, but because the game itself is designed for engagement rather than resolution. The man who refuses to play it, who continues doing his work in silence while others argue about it, is not losing. He is operating on a different timeline entirely. He is letting the noise expire, as all noise does, without giving it the oxygen of his attention. And when he speaks, it is not into the void of constant debate. It is in the form of his output, his results, his presence over time. That is the only response that actually matters. Part 7. The inner silence. There is a dimension to this that goes beyond social strategy, beyond the tactical use of silence in negotiations and confrontations and digital interactions. A dimension that is harder to talk about, but ultimately more important than all the rest. It is the cultivation of inner silence. The man who is noisy on the inside, whose mind is a constant commentary, a running debate, an anxiety machine producing an unbroken stream of self-evaluation, social replaying, worry about the future, and rehearsed responses to scenarios that haven't happened. That man cannot hold true silence externally. He can manage it. He can white-knuckle his way through situations where he wants to speak and doesn't, but it will feel like restraint, like holding something back. And people will feel the tension of that restraint. They will sense that the quiet is effortful, that underneath the surface something is working very hard not to break through. The man who has built inner silence, who has quieted, through practice and discipline, the noise inside his own head, holds external silence differently, not as restraint, but as ease. His quiet isn't the product of effort. It is the natural expression of a settled interior. And that quality, which is extremely rare, is felt by everyone in his presence as something that resists easy naming. They call it calm, they call it confidence, they call it presence. What they are actually sensing is a man who is genuinely comfortable with silence because his inner life is not a storm he is managing. It is a stillness he inhabits. How do you build this? Not quickly, not through reading or intellectual understanding. It is built through repeated encounters with your own discomfort, through periods of deliberate quiet, through the practice of sitting with your own thoughts without immediately reaching for a distraction. It is built through learning, gradually, that the things your anxious mind presents as urgent are rarely urgent, that the thoughts you feel you must express immediately are usually better for the delay, that the social fear driving constant speech is a learned response to an imagined threat that almost never actually materializes. The man who builds this inner stillness becomes something that the noisy world is increasingly unfamiliar with. A man who does not need the world to confirm his existence. He exists because he knows he exists. His validation is not external. His sense of his own worth does not fluctuate with how the last conversation went. He speaks not because silence makes him anxious, but because he has something worth saying. And he stays quiet, not to project an image of power, but because quiet is simply where he lives. This is the final form of silence as mastery. Not a tool, not a technique, an identity. The man who has arrived at this point is not deploying silence strategically in the way that someone new to these ideas might deliberately experiment with pausing before speaking or waiting before responding. He has stopped needing to think about it because silence has become his default state. Speech has become the deliberate act, chosen consciously for a purpose. Everything else is stillness. Part 8. What happens when silence meets silence? One final thing worth understanding. What happens when two men who understand the power of silence are in the same room? When neither is going to fill the space, neither is going to speak first out of anxiety, neither is going to react to provocation. This is a rare but illuminating encounter because it is the purest expression of what social power actually is. What you find in those encounters is that the competition that drives most social dynamics simply disappears. There is nothing to compete over. Neither man is seeking validation, neither is trying to be perceived as dominant, neither is filling space to signal that he has something to fill space with. What you get instead is a kind of mutual recognition. Two people who are not performing for each other, who are simply present, who can sit in shared silence without it being uncomfortable, who can exchange words when words are genuinely useful and not a syllable more. This kind of interaction is genuinely unusual. Most people never experience it because most interactions are driven by the anxiety of impression management, by the need to be seen in a certain way, by the social performance that consumes the vast majority of human energy in every interaction. When two people who have moved beyond that performance meet, the conversation that results is different in kind from ordinary conversation. More honest, more precise, more real. And this points to something important about what silence ultimately is in its deepest form. It is not a strategy for dominance, though it functions as one. It is not a technique for intimidation, though it produces that effect. At its core, silence is the expression of a man who does not need the external world to fill what is empty in him. A man who has built something on the inside that makes the constant noise of seeking unnecessary. A man who is, in the most fundamental sense, complete in himself. That completeness is what moves rooms. That completeness is what makes people pause when he enters and remember him when he leaves, not what he said, what he didn't say, the weight of what was held back, the knowledge that somewhere behind the stillness was a mind fully present, fully calibrated, choosing carefully every single word, knowing that the most powerful thing he could deploy in almost any situation was the silence before it. You have been given permission to stop talking. Not because silence is comfortable. It isn't at first. Not because it is easy. It isn't. In a world designed to make noise feel safe and quiet feel dangerous, but because in every room you will ever enter, in every conversation you will ever have, in every moment where your position in the social order is being negotiated invisibly, the man who has mastered silence holds an advantage so profound that it cannot be overcome by any amount of verbal skill, social charm, or strategic maneuvering. He holds the field without appearing to fight for it. He leads without declaring his leadership. He ends conversations without finishing sentences. He makes the room aware of him through his stillness. He is the most dangerous man present precisely because he appears to be doing nothing. That is the weapon. That is its power. That is what it costs to build it and what it pays when you do. Use it accordingly. Comment below, I speak when it matters, I win when I don't. Not for the algorithm. As a record for yourself that you understood what most men never will. The silence begins now.